When I start thinking about the sermon for a coming Sunday, there's 4 readings, one of which we sing usually. So we have the first reading, the second reading, there's the psalm in between, and we have the gospel. The first reading and the gospel often have similar themes, and so in putting together a sermon, that's usually a good place, material from both of those that will come together. In the old days, we would say it was an Old Testament, a New Testament, and gospel reading. And there's a few reasons why we don't use those terms anymore. But during this season in particular, we'd use it less because the first reading is not from the Old Testament. It's from the book of Acts. And the sermon this week did not to come together in one neat piece between those 2 readings. So you're going to get 2, kind of, sort of. It's not going to go long, though. Don't panic. But I want to start with the first reading that we have from the Acts of the Apostles. I think this is a really important season, not simply because Easter is a big deal as Christians and we think that's a great thing to celebrate, but also because we get more from the book of Acts. And the book of Acts, to me, reminds us in many cases about the distance of history between us and the first Christians, but also our close proximity in many ways. Maybe it's different for you, but when I read the Gospels, I have to take a second to kind of put myself in the shoes of the disciples as they follow Jesus around, or imagine that I was there when Jesus was doing something, and it feels distant in a fashion, both historically, but also I wasn't really there to see that. My experience of the faith is not as direct as would have been the case for the apostles right there when the blind man was healed. But in the book of Acts, we get kind of the regular first generation of Christians. It's kind of like if we could go back through enough committee minutes, we'd find these people sitting on some random committee somewhere. The sense that they are in many ways the same as us. And in fact, we just heard in regards to the story of doubting Thomas, blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe. Jesus talking about us directly. So one of the questions that we might ask is that if we think of this reading from Acts coming after the story of Pentecost, although we're not at Pentecost, but at any rate, it comes after the story of Pentecost. So we hear the story of Jesus, his crucifixion, his resurrection, the miracles that happen after. 50 days later, Pentecost. We hear just before that of Christ ascending, returning to heaven, and now everybody is left, right? We know the story of the ascension, people standing, watching Jesus go, and now what? Now what? When I read from the book of Acts, as Christians, there's a lot of this story that is along the lines of, and now what? What do we do now that Jesus is not here? In some ways, it may have been easy to follow him in a sense that there he is. I will follow him and watch what he does. But after the ascension, suddenly, well, now what? Now there are branches of Christianity that might say, now it's our turn to tell people how unfaithful they are in their following of Jesus. But what we get in today's reading is something else entirely. The disciples, in following Jesus after the ascension, after Pentecost, are doing a certain set of things. They are doing exactly the things that Jesus did. This idea that disciples could become the rabbis. The idea that those who follow will do the same work. This idea of healing, of feeding, of sharing the good news, the exact same things. Well, it's been 2,000 years. How might we know these things? Well, To start with, we'll gather every 7 days, say, and we will read from the Gospels the stories of what Jesus did in his earthly ministry, and we will seek to do those things, those exact things. That wasn't for a different time and place. We're about the healing of people. We think of the support that we have given to the Lutheran mission in South Sudan, the hospital and medical facility that is there. We are about that work of healing in what we do. We gather food every month in this place, and there are folks, Dale comes to mind, who stop by midweek to then take it to Ecumenical Hunger Program. We are at work feeding those who are hungry. When we gather in this space, this is not just an event for members of this church. Every week, we have people who join us who are not, and they hear the good news of Jesus Christ proclaimed. We gather, and like Christ did with his disciples, we share a meal of bread and wine. We do the same things. And in reading from Acts, we hear that is what we are called to do. That's part one of the sermon. I guess I would conclude that by saying, so keep it up. Second part is related to the gospel text that we have for today. John is kind of a big thinker. We're in the year of Mark, who is, I don't want to say Mark's a small thinker, but he's much more concise, to the point. It's the oldest gospel that we have. He's just very short. Everything happens immediately. It's kind of like the bullet point version, whereas John is more of like your systematics professor from seminary wrote the Gospel of John. And so it can get to be a little big. But today we hear about sheep and shepherds. Now, the 23rd Psalm that we sung, we get that classic language. In fact, I know for myself, often if I think of the words of it, I am too young for the King James Version to have been used in any church that I attended growing up. But even for me, that's how I hear it in my head. This classic language of the 23rd Psalm. But when we think of this image of sheep, we have separate characters in this story. And some of the things about this text that we have are the ways in which the narrative is written versus the way it is not written, or how it might otherwise could have been written. So we have sheep, we have a shepherd, and we have the hired hands. So these are the primary figures that we have in this story. Now, we might think of the hired hands, who get a very bad rap in here, and I hesitate to protest against Jesus too strongly, but the image of these are my sheep. And do you notice how the story is not written in regards to the sheep? The struggles of the shepherd and the hired hands are not like, is this the best pasture I could provide for them? Is there a better stream that they could be drinking from? That's not the narrative that we have. The narrative of the story is that the sheep are being attacked by wolves, scattered and killed. Yikes, this is a big thing. The shepherd is going to stand between the wolf and the sheep. The hired hand is going to be saying, you know, I asked for a raise and benefits last year, and I'm out at this point. I'm not doing this. There's a difference. Now, in the text, often the hired hand is referenced as the religious leaders of Jesus' day. I have to say, it would be easy, perhaps, for me to say, clearly not referencing religious leaders of this day, but I think it would be a missed opportunity for reflection in regards to the story. Even if the word pastor is Latin for shepherd, there is a sense that we are not Christ. Christ is at work among us. Christ gave his life for us. And as human beings, we struggle. We are sheep. When I was younger, I remember in elementary school when I was old enough to write, that at the beginning of the year after summer, we would often have to write a little something. I think the teacher was trying to see if we had remembered how to write various things that we might ask. What did you do over summer? I remember distinctly a couple of years, one of the questions would be like, what animal do you most associate with? To get a little feel for who this little person is returning back to class. And you know what? I don't recall anyone saying like chicken or sheep. That just was not one of the animals that would be selected. The animals that were selected primarily were like dolphin or cheetah or wolf, something that was really fun and exciting. And that's the way we like to think of ourselves, don't we? We like to think that way. But that's not always the way it pans out. There are many times when we feel vulnerable, when it feels like this beautiful narrative of our life that we are writing, that there is some other author that we don't like inserting pages and chapters that we would not have put in. There are all kinds of things in this life that make us realize how fragile we are. Maybe it's something as simple as a stumble. Perhaps it's a visit to a doctor, or being called into our boss's office, or a class we're taking that was supposed to be a lot easier than the one that we find ourselves in. There are any number of ways where we realize our vulnerability, perhaps like a sheep. The sense of the text is that we are called to stay together. As we gather in this space, we manifest that physically, being together. That we recognize that the shepherd is present with us. In the bread and wine, we know that Christ is with us. But the other thing that is interesting about this narrative that we have today and how it's written versus how it's not written is we have this reference to the other sheep. Notice how it's other. We get the word other there, right? But still the word sheep. It's not like there's another farm down the road that has llamas, or there's another farm that has goats, and the beautiful flock in the future is going to have sheep, goats, and llamas. No, that's not what it says. Other sheep. Just like us. As human beings, we often think of differences first, and not so much the things that bind us together. And I think in the gospel text for today, we recognize that in God's grace, that in many ways we should be thinking about the things that bind us together. In this life, we live and we die. We get sick, we get injured. There is new life, there is joy, there are cries from young mouths. There are all kinds of things that are common to all of us, even when the world around us is saying, no, you are not all sheep. You are different from one another and should be seen as other, such that we are against. Ukrainian and Russian, Palestinian, Israeli, dare I say, Republican, Democrat. There are all kinds of ways in which, when we hear the text today, we are reminded that where we should be starting our understanding of other is with the grace that God has shown us. That is where we should be starting. So if I was to hold up these two pieces of the sermon together, I feel like they don't quite go together. But I'll leave you with two thoughts in regards to this. As Christians after Pentecost, we are called to continue to do the things that Christ was about. To heal the sick, to feed the hungry, to share the good news of Jesus Christ. And in the gospel text, we are called to be mindful of those that we might think of as other, but rather who are in fact sheep like us, who have received God's grace when we didn't deserve it. Amen. Please stand as you are able.